So we are still in our series on what is truth, and we are up to point number 6 that we've been working on. Still working on that truth doesn't equal science and science doesn't equal truth. And last week we talked about how the evolutionists falsely use allele frequencies and homology comparisons to try to convince us that they're evidence of evolution. So now we're going to move on to discussing fossils. Several of you have expressed an interest in learning more about how fossils of the supposed cavemen and dinosaurs and all that fit into this. So over the next few weeks we are going to address that. Now, to start off with today, if evolution was true, we would find evidence of it in the fossil records. But not only that, if evolution was true, the gradual accumulation of new forms would lead to the existence of what they call transitional species. Those species that are gradually changing, that are like one gradation different from what they used to be. So they call those what they would be, I should say, transitional species. But here's the kicker. There wouldn't be just a handful of them. A gradual accumulation of genetic mutations which led to new forms and new species would literally create more transitional species than we could ever count. Let me put it to you this way. So not only would we be able to find evidence of evolution in the fossils of transitional forms, but there would be so many fossils of transitional forms that we would literally be tripping over them. They would be everywhere. But again, evolution has a big problem here. Poor evolution. Don't you kind of feel sorry for it, right? Because not only has such a bountiful harvest of transitional forms never been found in the fossil records, in spite of what you may have heard or what you've been taught. The fact is, there has never been one single fossil of a transitional form ever found. Not one. If such a transitional form had ever been found, evolution would no longer be a theory. Do you understand that? They would have their evidence. Now, over the years, evolutionists have claimed that they have found fossils of a transitional form. But, like when the NFL referees say, upon further review, after they go back and look at a play, right? All of these have turned out to either be inaccurate or an elaborate fabrication. And I think it's hilarious that the evolutionists will claim to find one fossil, mind you, they will claim that, of a transitional form, and the whole world jumps for joy over one fossil. But as I said, and as they well know, as well as I know, and I'm going to help you to know, in order for evolution to be true, there would have to be millions and billions and possibly even quadrillions of those transitional form fossils out there. However, they're not there. They have never found a single one. And I find it interesting to note, Charles Darwin himself didn't believe the necessary proof of evolution, the transitional forms, would ever be found in the fossil record. And he didn't believe that because he recognized that they don't exist. So look here what he wrote. Here's Darwin. Why, if species have descended from other species by insensibly fine gradations, do we not everywhere see innumerable transitional forms? Why is not all nature in confusion, instead of the species being, as we see them, well defined? Innumerable transitional forms must have existed. Why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crusts of the earth? Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against my theory. The most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against evolution existed in Darwin's day, and it still exists today unchanged. It still exists today because the fossils of transitional forms that were missing in Darwin's day are still missing today. The missing links are indeed missing because they don't exist. So the missing link is true. It's missing because it doesn't exist. University of Chicago paleontologist and curator of geology at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, which houses the world's largest fossil collection. Dr. David Ropp wrote in 1979, Darwin was embarrassed by the fossil record because it didn't look the way he predicted it would. Well, we're now about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. The record of evolution is still surprisingly jerky, and ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we did in Darwin's time. By this I mean that the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be modified or discarded as a result of more detailed information. In 1978, Dr. Colin Patterson, senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, published a book called Evolution. But in his book, he didn't include a single photo of a transitional form. When asked by aerospace engineer Dr. Luther Sunderland why he failed to include any such photos, here's how he responded. I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossils are living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest that an artist should be used to visualize such transformations, but where would he get the information from? I could not honestly provide it, and if I were to leave it to artistic license, would that not mislead the reader? Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. You say I should have at least show a photo of the fossil from which each type of organism was derived. I'll lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. So this, the previous quote from 1979, they said we had 250,000 fossils, and by now I'm sure we have probably over 1 million. Yet, according to the evolutionist's own words, they're forced to admit that even in the books that they write about evolution, they cannot cite even one fossil of a transitional form. Not one. And they can't cite this because they don't exist. And folks, that is straight from the horse's mouth. Okay? But in spite of this, they still want to cling to this fairy tale. So what you got to understand from all this is that this problem is recognized by the evolutionists. They don't even debate it. They know it and admit it. So let me give you some more. The late Dr. Stephen Jay Gould, who was the former paleontologist and professor of biology, geology, and the history of science at Harvard University, and one of the most outspoken evolutionists of his time, and possibly ever, stated the following: the fossil record, with its abrupt transitions, offers no support for gradual change. But he said more. During a lecture in 1980, Gould stated this: the fundamental reason why a lot of paleontologists don't care much for gradualism is because the fossil record doesn't show gradual change. And every paleontologist has known that since Cuvier. Gould also wrote the following: all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt. And then one more. Finally, Gould wrote this: the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, but not the evidence of fossils. The late Dr. Austin Clark, eminent zoologist at the Smithsonian Institution, stated this: no matter how far we go back in the fossil record of previous animal life upon Earth, we find no trace of any animal forms which are intermediate between the various major groups of phyla. He also, one of the classification groups, one of the largest groups underneath kingdom. Okay? Phyla is the plural of phylum. So he's talking about multiple phylum. He also wrote this: since we have not the slightest evidence, either among the living or the fossil animals, of any integrating types following the major groups, it is a fair supposition that there never have been any such integrating types. The late American geneticist, Dr. Richard B. Goldschmidt, wrote this: the facts of greatest importance are the following. When a new phylum, class, or order appears, there follows a quick, explosive, in terms of geological time, diversification so that practically all orders or families known appear suddenly and without any apparent transitions. Paleontologist Dr. David Kitts from the School of Geology and Geophysics at the University of Oklahoma, he wrote the following: despite the bright promise that paleontology provides a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists, the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. In his book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, biochemist Dr. Michael Denton wrote the following: "The fact that so many of the founders of modern biology, those who discovered all the basic facts of comparative morphology upon which evolutionary biology is based, held nature to be fundamentally a discontinuum of isolated unique types, unbridged by transitional varieties, a position absolutely at odds with evolutionary ideas." So it's very obvious. It's obviously very difficult to reconcile with the popular notion that all the facts of biology irrefutably support an evolutionary interpretation. Denton also wrote this: "It is still, as it was in Darwin's day, overwhelmingly true that the first easy for you to say, the first representatives, there we go, of all the major classes of organisms known to biology are already highly characteristic of their class when they make their initial appearance in the fossil record. This phenomenon is particularly obvious in the case of the invertebrate fossil record. At the first appearance in the ancient Paleozoic seas, invertebrate life was already divided into practically all the major groups with which we are familiar today." So I could do this much, much longer, but hopefully you're getting the point here. Here we go. Transitional forms are not there, and the evolutionists know it. Yes, sir?
This is probably not a stupid question, but can bacteria be turned into like fossils?
They don't have the body parts to allow that to happen. So bacteria are not good examples of something that's going to turn into a fossil.
What does it turn into? Just gets absorbed by other things?
That's correct.
Disintegrates.
That's correct. Yep. So they're not going to be one that you're going to find fossils of. There are times that they find them still encased, like in amber or something like that, where they still find them, but that's not a fossil. That is correct. We're going to talk about that as we move on too, because they've made some interesting finds from things that are encased in amber. All right. Yes. Yeah. Something like that, but not really that. But of course they try to put their spin on all this, right? And they try to convince people of the authenticity of evolution by citing reasons why they're not finding any transitional forms. And here's one of their examples. They claim the imperfection of the geological record destroyed all the transitional forms. I'm not making this up. They do cite this. The funny thing, though, is that all the non-transitional fossils are still there. So here, I guess, the geological records must be selective and discriminatory. It must just not like the transitional forms. I mean, really, I'm not making this up. Or the other thing they do is they keep changing the theory of evolution. And folks, the theory of evolution has changed repeatedly over the last 150 years. In fact, the theory of evolution is the only thing that's ever evolved. See that? The evolutionists keep coming up with theories to explain why there's no evidence to support their theory. Do you see how crazy this gets? And folks, if you want to buy what they're selling, then I got some swampland I can sell you, right? Let me give you a few more here. Dr. George Gaylord Simpson, considered the world's most the world's foremost evolutionary paleontologist of the 20th century. He wrote this: "It is thus possible to claim that such transitions are not recorded because they did not exist." Well, now we're getting somewhere. That the changes, however, well, listen to where we go here. That the changes were not by transitions, but by sudden leaps in evolution. So now evolution no longer happens gradually. It now happens by sudden leaps. The late American geneticist already referenced Dr. Richard Goldschmidt in his, what they call his 1940 seminal work, The Material Basis of Evolution. He wrote this: "The change from species to species is not a change involving more and more additional atomistic changes," but it's not, he's saying it's not about small changes, "but a complete change of the primary pattern or reaction system into a new one, which afterwards may again produce interspecific variation by micromutation." So what he's saying here, it doesn't happen in small, fine gradations. He's saying it happens all at once in big chunks. And what he used here with this, I was going to say logic, but that's not really logic. It's not reason. I was going to say reasoning. This, whatever you want to call it, anti of all that. He used all that, developed what he called the hopeful monster theory, where massive changes happen simultaneously. So evolution didn't happen gradually, but all at once. So therefore, there's no transitional fossils to be left in the records. Yes?
So what's the difference between a small change? What makes a small change a small change? What makes a big change?
Okay. So the differences we're talking about, for evolution to have happened, we mentioned it had to happen by genetic mutations, making small changes that eventually build up over time to make new forms, and then enough new forms to make new species. But now the opposite of this, let me further explain this. Here's what he's talking about. By the way, what he's saying flies in the face of Darwinian evolution. Okay, just to make that clear. So what he's talking about is that new species happen in single steps. And folks, this is exactly what this gets at. I'm not making this up. In essence, what would happen, a reptile laid an egg and it hatched into a bird. So that's the difference between the two. And that's exactly what they're talking about with this hopeful monster theory thing. And all I can say is, really, that's the horse you're backing. I mean, really. But I'm not making this up. But not only that, this has gone even further. Because in 1972, Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge revisited this theory that Goldschmidt came up with of the hopeful monsters, and they proposed another similar explanation, which they call punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium is a theory where evolution happens rapidly, and in rapidly they're talking about their definition of geological perspective, where they would say in tens or thousands of years as opposed to millions of years, okay? But it still happens via Darwinian evolution. So here's how this theory works. Species are generally stable in this theory, remaining unchanged for millions of years. But this relaxed pace is punctuated by rapid bursts of evolution that quickly creates new species. Very few fossils are left behind because the animals that experience evolution are off on their own somewhere, separated from the rest of the herd. being in these little isolated focus groups, the odds are much less likely that they'll leave fossils behind. Yeah, and you're all looking at me like, what? Well, so this is what this means. This is literally what this means. Evolution hides in the bushes for literally millions of years and just leaves life alone for a long time till it decides to jump out of the bushes and pounce on the antisocial species, the ones that are off by themselves, isolated from the herd, and it scares them into evolving quickly. Then it runs off and hides in the bushes again for another, sets of millions of years or whatever, waiting to pounce on life and ambush the antisocial species once again and scare them into evolving very quickly yet again. Folks, I'm telling you the truth. I'm not making this up. In fact, I don't think I could make up anything like this. This kind of stuff is so rich, you can't make this up. And that leads us to once again say, really, that's the horse you're backing. But if there's any accuracy to this theory, this really causes problem because I thought evolution was random. Randomness is the hallmark of evolution. But now they're trying to tell us that evolution can pick and choose. It can target where it wants to act, when it wants to act, which species it wants to act on. Okay? But in order for evolution to act in this manner, it has to have a strategic, planned course of action. And for that, then it must be driven by a force outside of itself. Otherwise, it's not acting randomly anymore. So you see how this is really flying in the face of the theory of evolution. If that version of the theory of evolution were true, then evolution is no longer random. And if evolution is no longer random, then this theory has gone into an irreversible tailspin, which it has anyway with all the evidence I've given you, but hopefully you get my point here. If this theory of evolution is accurate, then everything about evolution disintegrates. Without it being based on randomness, the theory of evolution crumbles. So then you got to ask the evolutionists, you have to ask them if they are talking to one, which is it? Is it targeted or is it random? Which theory are you pushing? And actually, it doesn't really matter, right? When you get right down to it, it doesn't matter which one people are getting behind because none of them make any sense. And most importantly, none of them are supported by the data. Once again, all you have is evolutionists talking out of both sides of their mouth.
That's funny to me, though.
What's that?
Charles Darwin said 100 years ago that his own theory was wrong.
Yes, he did. But the people who came after Darwin, even though Darwin wasn't convinced of it, took it and ran with it. If it hadn't been for the ones that came after him, it probably never would have gained the momentum that it had. So when the data don't fit their theory, as you're seeing every week, that happens all the time, what they do is they respond by changing their theory. And they've been doing it over and over and over. Now the sensible thing to do, when you have no evidence to support your claims, is to abandon your claims. And instead, adopt the claims of the truth, right? But they don't want to do that. They choose to continue their charade simply because they don't want the truth. And here's what really gets me is we call the scientists who propagate and cling to this foolishness, we call them intelligent. Really? Is that what you would call intelligent? Because it doesn't fit my definition of intelligent. Stop and consider that for a while. So in order to try to continue their charade, they're forced to fabricate the data and create fraudulent examples of evolution. I already explained that to you with the story of the peppered moths and their claims about how evolution is a change in the frequency of an allele within a gene pool. But what I'm going to do from this point on, mostly over next week, is give you some more examples of this kind of stuff, okay? What they do is they incorrectly assume the fossils that they find must represent transitional species because evolution's got to have them, even though they're not. And they find a fossil, they recognize that it's not a transitional form, but they tell the world it is a transitional form, and they erect an entire evolutionary hierarchy and timetable around the fossil. Without the fossil evidence, they still create all those cute evolutionary trees. They falsely assume this is how it must have happened. So here's our interpretation of what it would look like if they ever existed. It's just a head scratcher. As Stephen Jay Gould says, they used inference and not data. And what you have to understand, this goes on in every textbook, every museum out there that shows evolutionary trees of all the species of life. They create these trees without the fossil evidence to support it, but they still do it, and somehow they keep getting away with it. They admit they can't find any fossils of transitional forms, but they make their fossils to be them anyway. They just change the rules to make them fit their preconceived notions and their beliefs and bias. They knowingly and fraudulently redefine a transitional form in an attempt to force it into their warped belief system. Does that sound like a bunch of folks you want to put your trust in for anything? Yeah.
Absolutely.
There's one in every crowd, right? So, what I'm going to do, like I said, for mostly next week, I'm going to go through a bunch of specific examples of fossils that you have undoubtedly seen and heard of. And I'm going to give you the real story behind them. And I'm going to do that over the next couple weeks. But what I'm going to do today, I'm going to finish with one example. That example being what's commonly referred to as the Cambrian explosion. And what this is a simultaneous appearance in the fossil records. So, if you go into the first geological layer of fossils, that layer of strata, which they call the Cambrian layer, and by the way, these layers in the timetable are all the ones that the evolutionists have come up with themselves. So this is according to their own timetable. In that layer, all the groups of invertebrates appear suddenly and in distinct species, indicating that they all appeared in history at the same time. And this phenomenon is so pronounced that Scientific American called it life's Big Bang. That didn't change, did it? Oh, there it is. So you find fossils of all kinds of things like snails, jellyfish, sea hedgehogs, sponges, crustaceans.
I want to see a sea hedgehog.
other complex invertebrates, you find all of them having things like eyes, gills, circulatory system, and other advanced physiological structures that are no different from their counterparts, their modern counterparts. They're all found together without the evidence of any pre-existing ancestors. And there are too many radically different, complex, and differentiated body parts for them to have evolved from unicellular, one-celled things, precursors or ancestors, at the same time. It's just not possible. And within the defined animal groups, there are no traces of any transitional forms to link the different groups to a common ancestor. And this scenario is repeated throughout all the fossilized animal groups that are found in this layer. So if evolution was true, so many different lines of animals would not have arisen independently and simultaneously as the fossil record shows they did. Logically, they could not share a common ancestor for evolution to be true. But what's really interesting is not only what they find in this layer, but what's found in the layers above it and what's not found in the layers below it. The Cambrian layer has virtually every phyla known to man. All the major body plans, the enormous varieties of life, all coexist in this layer simultaneously. But when you go to the layers below the Cambrian layer, you have practically nothing in regard to fossils. The few creatures that are found below the Cambrian layer are all soft-bodied organisms like worms. That's all they find. So essentially what we have here, you have nothing in the lines of organic complexity, pre-Cambrian, and then in the Cambrian, everything appears. And to compound this problem, when you look at the number of fossilized species above the Cambrian layer, they gradually decrease with each successive layer. What you find when you reach the most recent layers, approximately 98% of everything that has existed has gone extinct. And that's something you'll never hear of. In fact, in spite of the fact that it's hard data. Not surprisingly, what you hear from the evolutionists and from our media that propagates everything is that the Earth's lifeline looks like a tree. Right? With fewer animals in the beginning, our supposed common ancestors, that then evolved into all these branches of more species. But the data say otherwise. The Earth's lifeline is just the opposite. With an explosion of species in the beginning that have gradually gone extinct, leaving fewer species existing today. So if it was a tree, the tree's upside down. All the branches and leaves are down here, coming down to the, less of them at the top. So these data of the fossil record is diametrically opposed to what would be predicted by evolution. Evolution simply cannot explain how all of a sudden the Earth came to overflow with such a great number of animal species, and how the different distinct types of species with no common ancestors could have emerged. evolution cannot explain any of that. And please remember, all the geological layers and demarcations and dates are the ones the evolutionists themselves have generated. So even according to their own timetable, it doesn't work. These conclusions are derived from a time scale and geological framework that they created. Therefore, bottom line is that everything about the Cambrian explosion goes against the theory of evolution, from a simpler to a higher life form. Everything about the fossil record goes against their theory. So I am going to stop there today with that one. And next week, we're going to go through a bunch of specific examples of fossils. And I'm pulling in as many pictures as I can so you can see them visually. And we're going to go through them all. And I'm going to give you the real story on all of those, in spite of what you might have heard about them. So we will stop there today.